My name is Clara Vance. Pull up a chair, make yourself a cup of coffee, and let's just sit together for a moment. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to be completely honest with yourself when you answer it. Have you ever sat across from someone who shared your exact bloodline, looked into their eyes, and realized with absolute, bone-chilling certainty that they don't actually see you as a human being? Have you ever realized that, to the people who were supposed to protect you, you aren't actually wanted? You are simply useful? If you have ever had to quietly earn your place in your own family, or if you've spent years playing a role just to keep the peace, pull your mug a little closer. This story is for you. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just a normal, unremarkable, rainy Tuesday in the middle of April. I was sitting at the kitchen island in my mother's house. If you saw her kitchen, you would think it belonged in an architectural magazine. It's all immaculate white quartz, cold-brushed gold fixtures, and custom cabinetry where everything is hidden behind seamless panels. Nothing is out of place. No keys on the counter, no random mail, no signs of actual life. That is exactly how my mother, Eleanor Vance, likes it. She is the senior vice president of operations at an elite multi-million-dollar private medical firm. She doesn't have a home. She has an executive suite that she happens to sleep in. My 5-year-old daughter, Lily, was sitting on the floor in the adjacent sunroom. She was wearing her favorite yellow sweater, the one with the slightly frayed left sleeve that she refuses to let me throw away. And she was completely absorbed in drawing a family of ducks with her crayons. Lily has a rare, deeply private, chronic autoimmune condition. It's a condition we have spent 3 years managing with strict diets, quiet hospital visits, and an absolute fortress of medical privacy. She doesn't know she is different yet. She just thinks the world is a place where sometimes your joints ache and sometimes you have to take a sweet-tasting syrup before breakfast. I was typing an edit on a medical journal compliance layout on my laptop when my mother walked in. She didn't say hello to me. She didn't bend down to kiss the top of Lily's head. She walked straight to the quartz island, adjusted her tailored linen blazer, and slid a heavy, glossy corporate marketing brochure across the smooth surface toward me. The paper was thick, the kind of high-grade stock that costs thousands of dollars just to print a single run. I looked down, and my breath caught in my throat. Right there, on the primary cover of the corporate prospectus, was a high-resolution, full-page photograph of my daughter. She was sitting in a clinical chair, looking small and vulnerable, holding her teddy bear. Below her image, printed in a clean, modern sans serif font, were her exact initials, her age, her specific genetic markers, and a detailed clinical breakdown of her private chronic condition. It was a complete case study, laid bare for public investors, packaged beautifully as a marketing asset to prove her firm's cutting-edge diagnostic capabilities. I felt the blood drain from my face. My fingers went entirely numb against my laptop keys. I looked up at my mother. She didn't flinch. She leaned against the counter, crossed her arms, and gave me that familiar, tight, superior smirk. The one she used whenever she had successfully managed a situation before anyone else could react. "Oops," she said, her voice entirely light, airy, and conversational. "I know how protective you are, Clara. But it secured the regional partnership this morning. The board was absolutely captivated by the human element. Don't be overly sensitive. It's just a case study, and her face is partially shadowed. Think of what this does for our family's profile in the medical community. It's just business. Business. My 5-year-old daughter's medical vulnerability, her private struggle, traded like a currency to impress a boardroom full of international investors. At that exact moment, the room went completely silent. I could hear the faint scratch of Lily's yellow crayon in the next room. My mother stood there, waiting for me to gasp, waiting for me to cry, waiting for me to start the predictable, emotional screaming match that she always won by calling me hysterical. But I didn't scream. I didn't drop a single tear. I slowly reached out, took my ceramic coffee mug and set it down on the quartz counter with a soft, controlled click. Something inside me, a fragile wire that had been stretched tight for 35 years, didn't break. It solidified. I looked at her smirk, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical clarity. If you're listening to this right now, and you're the person who always had to be strong, always had to be the adult in the room, while everyone else got to have a crisis, do me a favor. Type the word boundaries in the comments section down below. I want to see how many of us spent our childhoods serving as the invisible pillars holding up a house that didn't even appreciate the foundation. To understand why I didn't scream at my mother that Tuesday afternoon, you have to understand the architecture of our family. My name is Clara, and as I mentioned before, I edit medical journals and corporate compliance logs for a living. I am the person companies hire when they need to make sure their dense, multi-layered contracts don't accidentally reveal a vulnerability. I read the fine print. I look at sentences that engineers, doctors, and executives write, and I make sure those sentences do not say more than they mean. My life is quiet on purpose. I work from a small, sunlit bungalow, I drive a modest car, and I pay my own bills. I learned very early that if you don't depend on loud people, they lose the right to dictate the volume of your life. My mother, Eleanor, is the definition of loud. Not in her vocal delivery. She speaks in the measured, icy tones of a seasoned executive, but loud in her control. For as long as I can remember, she has used praise like a weapon. Since I was 6 years old, she called me the sturdy one. When I was 22, she called me reliable. I thought it was a compliment. I thought being the sturdy child meant I was respected. It took me a very long time and a very specific conversation with my late grandmother to realize that sturdy is just the word narcissistic parents use for the child they intend to load with their heaviest burdens without offering a single word of genuine thanks. Then, there is my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe is 2 years younger than me, and her designated family label has always been fragile. Fragile is the ultimate shield in a toxic household. It means you never have to clean up your own mess. You never have to apologize, and you never have to grow up. When Chloe was small and threw tantrums that broke my grandmother's antique porcelain dishes, my mother would look at me and say, "Clara, you should have been watching her. You know how sensitive her temperament is." I was 7. Chloe was 5. When we were teenagers and Chloe secretly took my carefully researched high school thesis paper from my computer, copied it word for word, and turned it in as her own, the teacher called us both into the office. My mother didn't defend me. She drove to the school, held Chloe's hand, and told the principal that Chloe was going through an identity struggle and that I, as the older sister, should simply write a new paper to show my support. I actually remember my college graduation day like it was yesterday. I had worked 3 part-time jobs to put myself through school without asking my mother for a single dollar. At the celebratory dinner, just 15 minutes after the appetizers arrived, Chloe's phone rang. Her boyfriend at the time had sent her a minor, dismissive text message. Chloe immediately dissolved into tears, gasping for air at the table. My mother didn't even look at my degree on the cloth placemat. She stood up, grabbed her designer purse, and said, "Clara, be a dear and handle the bill. Chloe is having an emotional emergency and needs to go home right now." They left. I sat in that restaurant completely alone. staring at my graduation cap, and ate my dessert in silence. I paid the check with my own hard-earned money and walked back to my dorm. That was the pattern. My boundaries were systematically eroded for decades because I was expected to carry the weight, while Chloe was allowed to be a victim of her own making, and Eleanor pulled the strings from her corporate high tower. But there was one person who refused to play Eleanor's game. Her name was Miriam Vance, my grandmother. She was a woman who had spent 40 years inside corporate law back when women weren't even given a designated desk in the room. She knew exactly what my mother was. She knew exactly what my sister was. And she spent the final years of her life quietly, ensuring that the sturdy child wouldn't be left carrying the weight of a broken family empire forever. 18 months ago, in January of 2025, my grandmother Miriam passed away. She didn't go out with a dramatic corporate exit or a loud mourning family gathered around her bed. She passed away on a quiet Thursday morning, with the winter sun hitting the hand-knit blanket on her lap. My mother, true to form, stayed at the hospice facility for exactly 30 minutes before checking her Apple Watch and announcing she had an emergency executive operations meeting. She couldn't reschedule. Chloe didn't come at all. She sent a lengthy text message about how seeing illness was deeply triggering to her delicate nervous system. I was the one who held Miriam's hand. I was the one who listened to her breathing slow down until it simply stopped. 2 days after the funeral, my mother was already in Miriam's house, tracking mud across the Persian rugs, counting the silver, and making calls to estate liquidators. She told the family that Miriam had been getting confused in her final months. She was setting the stage to invalidate anything Miriam had left behind that didn't align with her corporate itinerary. What Eleanor didn't know, what she could never have parsed with her arrogant, fast-moving eyes, was that Miriam had spent the final summer of her life at her old oak kitchen sink, washing coffee mugs and talking to me in a low, unwavering whisper. I remember one afternoon vividly. Miriam was drying a porcelain saucer, her hands slightly trembling from the advanced age, but her eyes were as sharp as two flints. She looked out the window at my mother, who was barking orders into a Bluetooth earpiece on the patio. Miriam turned to me and said, "Clara, listen to me very carefully. Your mother calls you sturdy because she needs someone to carry her failures without complaining. She thinks because you are quiet, you aren't calculating. Do not let her make you a pack mule for her ambition. When the time comes, you look at the fine print." Then she handed me an old, battered, leather-bound book. It looked like a standard family recipe journal. The cover was stained with vanilla extract and old grease marks from the 1980s. When my mother saw me carrying it out of the house later that week, she actually snorted. "Taking the cooking notes, Clara? Fitting. I'll take the real assets." But when I got home to my small bungalow and turned past the pages for buttermilk biscuits and heirloom pot roast, the handwriting shifted. It wasn't recipes anymore. Miriam, using her 40 years of corporate legal expertise, had meticulously pasted private stock certificates, hidden compliance regulations, and internal corporate governance codes directly onto those lined pages. For 2 decades, Eleanor had been utilizing a family-funded private clinic, originally established by Miriam, to run her firm's high-end diagnostic trials. Eleanor viewed that clinic as her personal kingdom. She thought she had completely absorbed it into her corporate medical firm. But Miriam's hidden notes detailed a massive, ironclad legal loophole. The underlying land, the proprietary patient databases, and the core operational foundation of that clinic didn't belong to Eleanor's firm at all. They were entirely owned by Miriam's private foundation trust. And in the final, signed line of that hidden notebook, dated July 14, 2024, Miriam had written a single directive: To my granddaughter, Clara Vance, you are the sole successor trustee. The keys to the fortress belong to the one who edits the text. Use them when they cross the line. For 18 months, I kept that book in the bottom drawer of my desk, right next to Lily's medical charts. I never told my mother it existed. I never told my sister. I let them think they had won the estate. I let Eleanor think she had inherited the entire family legacy while I was left with a stained book of chicken broth recipes. I carried that knowledge quietly, never letting a single hint show on my face, waiting to see if Eleanor would ever prove my grandmother wrong. She didn't. Sitting at that white quartz island, looking at my daughter's face exploited on a corporate brochure, I realized the time had finally come. Eleanor hadn't just crossed the line, she had erased it. Let's lean in a little closer now, because this is where the corporate mask completely slips off, and you get to see how a highly intelligent, calculating antagonist actually operates. My mother wasn't some cartoon villain who twirled a mustache and laughed out loud. No, she was far more dangerous than that. She was a woman who spoke in the vocabulary of corporate efficiency, structure, and forward progress. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that her ambition was a righteous fire that protected this family. "Clara," she said, her voice dropping into that smooth executive register she used when she was closing a multi-million-dollar deal with overseas stakeholders. She walked around the quartz island, picked up a crystal pitcher of cucumber water, and poured herself a glass. You need to look at the macro perspective here. You are looking at this like a freelance editor living in a small bungalow. I am looking at this like the head of a legacy. She took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving my face. Do you have any idea what this international merger means? The conglomerate we are partnering with requires absolute, concrete proof of our proprietary data gathering capabilities. They wanted to see an active, real-time longitudinal study of a rare autoimmune condition managed within our private network. Lily's files were perfect. They were immaculate. By integrating her case metrics into our primary prospectus, I didn't just secure a corporate partnership. I guaranteed myself the position of managing director and a 3% global equity stake in the parent company. I sat perfectly still. I didn't interrupt her. When you are dealing with an arrogant person who thinks they are the smartest mind in the room, the most dangerous thing you can do is interrupt them. You let them talk. You let them lay out every single piece of their own scaffold. And let's be completely practical, she continued, a faint, condescending smile touching the corners of her lips. That equity stake will eventually fund Lily's private education. It will secure her medical care long after you are gone. I am managing this family's long-term survival, Clara. You should be thanking me for having the foresight to turn a minor domestic challenge into a massive corporate asset. It's leverage. That's how the world works. She genuinely believed her own lie. She had completely convinced herself that violating my 5-year-old daughter's medical privacy, putting her genetic vulnerabilities on display for a boardroom full of anonymous investors in tailored suits, was an act of maternal protection. A few minutes later, my younger sister Chloe walked into the kitchen. She was dressed in a pristine designer lounge set, holding a high-end iced matcha latte. She looked at the brochure on the counter, then looked at my pale face, and immediately rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, Clara, please tell me you aren't making a massive scene about this," Chloe sighed, dropping onto one of the leather bar stools. "Mom told me about the brochure this morning. It's literally not a big deal. Nobody even knows those initials stand for Lily except us. You are always so incredibly dramatic about boundaries. Honestly, Mom works 80 hours a week to maintain our lifestyle, and you're upset because she used a few charts? It's completely selfish of you." An hour later, Chloe went a step further. She opened her Instagram account, where she had built a modest following as a lifestyle influencer funded entirely by my mother's monthly corporate allowances, and posted a glossy, black and white photo of a stormy ocean. Underneath it, she typed a weaponized, pseudo-intellectual quote she had lifted from a self-help blog. Sometimes, the heaviest burden of leadership is enduring the small-minded criticism of the people you are actively trying to save. Family sacrifice, vision growth. A college friend of mine saw the post and texted me a screenshot within 10 minutes. I looked at the image on my phone screen. I looked at the text message. I looked back at my mother and sister, who were now casually discussing which catering service to hire for the upcoming corporate celebration dinner. They thought they had won. They thought I was going to pack up Lily's drawings, drive back to my small bungalow, cry into my pillow, and eventually accept the crumbs of their corporate success because I was the sturdy one. They thought my silence was compliance. I didn't say another word to either of them. I calmly packed Lily's crayons back into her little tin box, zipped up her small backpack, and helped her put on her yellow sweater. My mother didn't look up from her iPad as we walked toward the front door. Chloe was busy editing a filter onto her next social media upload. I let the heavy oak front door click shut behind us with that same quiet, final precision my grandmother had practiced her entire life. When I got to my Honda CR-V, I buckled Lily securely into her car seat. She looked at me through the rearview mirror, her eyes wide and innocent. "Are you sad, Mama?" she asked quietly. I turned around, met her gaze, and gave her a genuine, completely unhurried smile. "No, baby," I said, my voice as smooth as velvet. "Mama is not sad at all. I just figured out exactly how to solve a very old puzzle." I drove us back to our bungalow in Plaza Midwood. The rain was coming down in steady, rhythmic sheets against the windshield, creating a comforting, isolated world inside the car. I didn't rush. I drove with my hands at 10 and 2, obeying every speed limit, feeling an extraordinary, unfamiliar weightlessness lifting off my chest. For 35 years, I had been running on the treadmill of trying to protect their feelings, trying to prevent their tantrums, trying to be the reliable daughter who kept the family intact. That treadmill had just stopped. Once Lily was safely asleep in her bed, wrapped in her daisy print duvet, I walked down the narrow hallway to my home office. I sat down at my desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and lifted out my grandmother Miriam's old leather-bound recipe book. Under the warm glow of my desk lamp, I began to read the fine print. As a medical journal compliance editor, my mind works like a grid. I don't look at the emotion behind text. I look at the legal structural liability. I turned past the page for heirloom pot roast and focused entirely on the dense handwritten legal citations Miriam had left behind. There it was, clear as day, cross-referenced with the public registry filings of my mother's firm. The private clinical facility Eleanor used to gather Lily's medical data. The very clinic she had bragged about, absorbing into her corporate empire, was heavily funded by an old endowment from Miriam's private foundation trust. Eleanor assumed that because she had corporate operational control of the building, she owned the assets inside it. But according to the strict, ironclad foundation bylaws Miriam had drafted in 2008 and amended right before her death, any proprietary patient databases compiled within that specific facility were strictly bound by a non-commercialization penalty. The clause was breathtakingly precise. If any executive or board member utilized patient metrics or diagnostic records from the trust's facility for personal corporate advancement, third-party marketing, or international merger leverage without the explicit, unanimous consent of the successor trustee, the entire data transfer was legally voided. Furthermore, the individual responsible would be classified as committing a catastrophic compliance breach, triggering an automatic clawback of all trust-funded assets, corporate titles, and inheritance rights. Eleanor thought she had bypassed me because I was just a freelance editor living in a small house. She had completely forgotten that Miriam had made me the sole legally registered successor trustee of that foundational estate. I spent the next 6 hours in absolute stillness, sitting with my coffee mug as the clock ticked past 3 a.m. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel a desire for revenge. I felt the pure, cold satisfaction of a mathematician solving an equation. I scanned the corporate prospectus Eleanor had given me, attached the digital certified copies of Miriam's trust bylaws, and compiled a flawless 32-page compliance report. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call my father. I didn't send a warning text to my mother. I simply prepared the files, verified the digital signatures, and scheduled the delivery for the one room where my mother's loud voice would mean absolutely nothing: the internal corporate compliance board of her own firm. If you have ever sat completely still while someone thought they were destroying you, knowing you held the exact piece of paper that would undo their entire reality, type the word victory in the comments right now. Because that is the precise moment the cycle of generational trauma stops. When you realize that intelligence and silent preparation will always outlast loud, arrogant manipulation. The corporate showdown didn't happen in a yelling match over Sunday dinner. It happened on a Friday morning, exactly 10 days after my mother slid the brochure across her kitchen counter. Eleanor had scheduled what she called a family alignment meeting at her firm's high-rise headquarters in downtown Charlotte. She had invited me under the guise of discussing Lily's future educational trust fund. Chloe was there, too, sitting in a leather chair with her designer bag, looking at her nails and completely bored by the corporate scenery. What Eleanor didn't expect was that when she opened the frosted glass doors to the executive boardroom, the entire internal corporate compliance board was already sitting at the table. My mother froze for a fraction of a second, her executive mask slipping just enough for me to see the sudden panic in her eyes. "Clara," she said, her voice dropping into a tight, warning whisper, "what is the meaning of this? This is a private family discussion. Why is the compliance committee here?" I didn't answer her with emotion. I walked to the head of the table, sat down across from the firm's chief legal counsel, and pulled out my grandmother Miriam's certified legal documents. "Mom," I said, my voice completely calm, unhurried, and steady, "this isn't a negotiation. You scheduled this meeting to integrate Lily's private medical files into your international merger prospectus. But as the sole legally registered successor trustee of the Miriam Vance Foundation estate, I have already reviewed the filing. And I am denying consent." Eleanor snorted, trying to regain her footing in front of her colleagues. "You don't have the authority to deny consent, Clara. The clinic that compiled those files operates under our corporate umbrella. You are being hysterical and difficult, just like always. It's my clinic." "It isn't your clinic," I replied, sliding a multi-page document across the mahogany table toward the chief legal counsel. "The underlying data gathering infrastructure, the server networks, and the patient databases within that facility are entirely owned by the Foundation Trust, Miriam, built in 2008. And according to Section 14, Paragraph B of the bylaws, any utilization of that proprietary patient data for commercial, corporate, advancement, or third-party marketing without the explicit written consent of the successor trustee constitutes a catastrophic compliance breach." The chief legal counsel picked up the document, his eyes scanning the dense, handwritten citations Miriam had left behind. The room went absolutely, terrifyingly silent. You could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. My mother stood there, her face losing all color as she watched the legal team realize exactly what she had done. I looked at her, and a short, vivid memory surfaced in my mind. I remembered my grandmother Miriam lying in her hospice bed, her voice barely a whisper, holding my hand while Eleanor barked corporate orders on the patio outside. Miriam had looked at me and said, "The law doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room, Clara. It belongs to the person who actually reads the fine print." The chief legal counsel closed the folder, looked up at my mother, and sighed heavily. "Eleanor, this is a catastrophic operational liability. By exporting this trust-protected data into the international prospectus without Clara's signature, you have exposed this entire firm to an international data privacy lawsuit from the Foundation estate. We cannot insulate the company from this. The merger is compromised." My sister Chloe stood up, her voice cracking with sudden, performance-driven panic. "Clara, stop it! You are ruining everything. Mom worked for years for this promotion, and how can you be so incredibly cruel to your own family?" I didn't even look at Chloe. I kept my eyes on my mother, who was now gripping the back of an executive chair so hard her knuckles turned white. "The board has already made its decision, Eleanor," the legal counsel continued, his voice devoid of any warmth. "To protect the firm from an immediate injunction, we are completely removing Lily's case study from the prospectus, which means the merger terms will have to be entirely renegotiated. Furthermore, due to the severe compliance breach outlined in the trust's clawback provision, your promotion to managing director is officially rescinded. Your current contract is terminated for cause, effective immediately. You have until 5 o'clock to empty your office." The fallout from that Friday morning was a quiet, systematic dismantling of an empire built on sand. My mother was ushered out of the building by security at 4:42 p.m., carrying a single cardboard box containing her desk calendar and her executive awards. Because her contract was terminated for cause due to a compliance violation, her multi-million-dollar severance package was completely erased. Chloe's luxury condo lease, which had been paid for via a trust-funded corporate allowance managed by Eleanor, was terminated by the property group 90 days later. She was forced to move into a tiny, unrenovated studio apartment and take a real job working retail on the weekends. The first text from my mother came that Sunday evening. It wasn't an apology. It was a 5-minute-long voice memo filled with crying, followed by an angry accusation that my grandfather and grandmother had brainwashed me against her. I didn't respond. I forwarded the audio file directly to Walt, the trust's primary compliance attorney, and went back to folding Lily's laundry. My sister Chloe tried a different tactic. She posted a long, tearful video on her Instagram story talking about toxic family cutoffs and how hard it is to heal when the people you love refuse to understand your perspective. I didn't watch it. A college friend sent me a screenshot, and I simply deleted the image from my phone. When a person becomes an expert at quoting self-help books to justify the cruelty they inflicted on a 5-year-old child, they lose the right to an audience. But the most surprising shift happened inside my own home. On a warm Saturday morning in late May, a modest sedan pulled into my gravel driveway. My father, Philip, got out of the car. For 40 years, my father had been a ghost in his own life. He was a man who had built an entire personality around retreating to the garage, playing golf in expensive sweaters, and silently stepping out onto the patio whenever my mother started saying something cruel. He had spent 4 decades avoiding conflict by pretending he couldn't hear the destruction happening in the next room. He walked up my front steps, holding a small white bakery box in one hand and a black plastic pot containing a young, vibrant magnolia tree in the other. He didn't make a grand speech. He didn't ask for a dramatic forgiveness dinner. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a heavy, quiet regret that he had carried for 30 years. "Georgie," he said, using the childhood nickname I hadn't heard him utter in over a decade. "I should have stood in the room. I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. I didn't burst into tears. I didn't throw my arms around him. But I nodded, stepped aside, and held the screen door open. "The shovel is in the shed, Dad," I said softly. "Let's go plant the tree." We spent the next 2 hours in the backyard. My 5-year-old daughter, Lily, ran around the yard, showing him her drawings of ducks, while my father quietly dug a deep, careful hole in the soil to plant the magnolia. He didn't look comfortable, but he looked aware. And for the first time in my adult life, I saw my father smile at me on purpose. "Let's sit together with one final thought before you go today." Take a deep breath with me. If you are listening to this story right now, I want you to do something practical. Check your boundaries. Check who has your school pickup list. Check who has the keypad code to your front door. Check who has been granted the implicit right to make decisions about your worth when you aren't in the room. And if you find a loophole where a toxic person is trading your peace for their corporate or emotional advancement, change the locks. My grandmother Miriam left 2 final voicemails in Walt's legal safe that I will never hear. One is for Lily on the day she turns 18. One is for Lily on the day she has her own first child. My grandmother will not be alive to see those days, and neither will I, but that is the ultimate definition of maternal love. Building a future you don't even have to be present in, just to ensure your child is completely safe in it. The most loving thing my grandmother ever did was leave when she was ready. The second most loving thing she did was write down the fine print. I am Clara Vance. I am 35 years old. My daughter is safe, my bungalow is quiet, and the magnolia in the garden is already growing tall enough for a tire swing.